Good morning, everybody. Good to see you guys. I feel like the time between when I preach, which is only like I think it's like every 5 or 6 weeks or something, seems to be like super short. I'm like, wasn't I just here? But anyways, the reason I say that, it kind of leads into what I'm speaking on today. I don't like doing this. It's not because I don't like speaking or like teaching God's word. I love doing that. I just don't like public speaking, like in front of a huge crowd of people. So every time I come up here, it's kind of like pushing myself outside of my comfort zone a lot. So every time I come up here, I'm a little like, but the reason why I kind of wanted to start with that is because today's sermon that I'm going to be preaching about is called Contagious Faith. But the reason why we need to have faith is because oftentimes it's really easy to have fear. And so I'm going to be preaching about this topic of fear and how to kind of defeat that and have instead contagious faith today. I remember a few weeks ago, we were in our staff meeting and we were kind of just randomly talking. Sometimes we go on these like long tangents that we aren't really, I don't know, it's weird. Everyone's laughing and Maria's like, you guys, we have things we need to get through. But we were talking about something and this topic of fear came up. And it's something that I'm really like passionate about talking about because it's something I've struggled with a lot in my life. So we're talking about it and then James said like, maybe you should preach on fear. And I was like, well, maybe. But I wasn't sure like when the right time would be to talk about it. And so I was kind of praying about it and I decided that I would talk about fear today, but mostly about having contagious faith. And so for those of you who don't know me, I've been in the church for a while, but you might not have known all of this about me. I used to struggle a lot with fear, fear of like the unknown, fear of conflict, still struggle with that one, fear of just random things that are ridiculous that people, if I said it out loud, people would be like, seriously, you were scared of that? But I often chose to pull back or retreat from either relationships or situations so that I wouldn't have to face my fear. It was kind of like something that I did. And I never really took chances. I never really pushed myself outside my comfort zone very often. And what started to happen as I kind of hit my early 20s, I had this situation come up, which was that I got pregnant. And don't worry, I was married. But I got to the point in my pregnancy, I was like 8 months in my pregnancy, and I realized like, wow, this is actually going to be over soon. Like, I'm going to have an actual child. And I like was at the time doing a practicum in an elementary school, and I was sitting there listening to this horrible band performance. And I was just like, man, one day, this little baby is going to be out there, like in the school, performing terribly with the other kids. And I was just like, this is crazy. Like, I can't believe that this is one day my baby that I've just been like, I haven't even met yet is going to be independent and like going off on his own. And so I was just like, oh my goodness, he's going to be independent. He's going to be going off on his own and I won't be able to protect him. And oh my goodness, like, and it was like this like seed of fear kind of got planted. And that was like that moment where it was like, I went from almost like, yeah, you know, I had normal anxieties like everybody kind of does to like everything was scary. The world's a scary place. No one should be like out of their homes. We should all just be homeschooling our kids and never leave this like the safety of our own home. And it was weird. It kind of happened over time. It was started out with like little things and eventually it got to the point where like the smallest little things that normal people would be like, whatever, I just do that. I was just like, I'm not doing that. Like, I wouldn't phone anybody. I wouldn't go to the grocery store by myself because then I'd have to talk to the person who's like helping me pay for my groceries. I wouldn't go to church by myself, which is weird because I was coming to church for like since I was 9 by myself with my grandma. And so it's just this like crazy thing that happened. It was like a shift in me where I was just like, I can't do things on my own. It was too scary. It took me a lot of years, which it wasn't good because by that time it got worse, to get to the point where I realized I actually needed to fight against that fear. Like, I didn't think of it as like, oh, this is something that I can choose to have or not to have. I was like, this is just who I am. I'm scared. You know, like I'm a fearful person. I can't change that. And so I was kind of in this cycle for a long time, got to a point where I was like, this is actually like destroying my life. I can't do anything. Every like menial task that I have to do is like something that feels like an all-out battle. And so I got to that point, but I didn't really know what to do about it. It was something that I faced so much every day that it was exhausting. I don't know if you guys have ever had that before, where you're just like, I'm so tired of doing this, like I can't do this. But basically, at that point, I realized like either I can stay in this and it's going to be hard, or I can try to get out of this and it's going to be hard. But either way, it was going to be hard. So a little while later, it was like probably, I think, 5 or 6 years later, after I kind of started to have that initial fear, I was at Pines Camp. Some of you guys might have heard this story before. God kind of like, I think, orchestrated this, but Ben wasn't able to go. And I said earlier, like, I couldn't go out by myself. So Ben wasn't able to go because we have 2 kids. And we made this deal that if like more girls were signed up to go to camp, then I would go, and we would get like a volunteer for the boys. And then if more boys were there, then he would go and we'd get a volunteer for the girls. And so more girls signed up, and I find myself at Pines Camp, and I was like in such a bad mood. Like I had like the worst attitude about it. I was like, I do not want to be here. I don't like know what I have to contribute. I'm just gonna like basically be a babysitter this whole week. And I just had like this horrible attitude about it. And then a little while into it, the guy that was speaking said, like, how many of you guys have actually fully invested in your faith? How many of you have actually like chased after Jesus to the point where you don't say no anymore? Like when he asks you to do something, you just say yes. And I was like, I never do that. Like I never really say yes, because I'm always like in my house, like scared. And so I was like, you know what? I'm gonna do an experiment. I'm like out of cell phone service. I can't complain to Ben or get like pity party. So I'm gonna just like in this week, I'm just gonna fully say yes to God. Like whenever he asks me to do something, even if it seems really dumb to me or it seems really scary, I'm just gonna do it. And so I did, and I ended up doing things like rock climbing, which I hated, and high ropes, which also wasn't fun. What else did I do? I played like a bunch of games, and I don't really like games, but I was like, the teens would ask me to do something, and I was like, I have to say yes, like I'm gonna do it. And so the whole week I kind of did this, and by the end of the week, I feel like that was a really transformational moment for me, because by the end of the week, Ben came back to get us, and he was like, I was expecting to basically have to scrape you off the floor. And he's like, and you were just like so excited, so happy, like you were like enjoying the worship, and like he's like, where's my wife? Like, that's not her. I don't know who this is. And so it was a really big moment for me where I just chose to say yes to God. I chose to say no to my fear and to the things that were holding me captive. And I was like, I'm just gonna try and see what happens and just give it a week, you know? And then I came home, and it was still hard. Like I still came against fear, I still do. But it was interesting because a shift in my mind happened, not so much like that I just didn't have fear anymore, but this shift happened where I was like, I have control over this. Like I can actually choose whether or not I'm gonna give in to my fear. I'm gonna say no, and I'm gonna walk the other way. Even though it's gonna be hard, and even though there's gonna be other battles that I'm gonna have to face, I'm not gonna keep giving in to fear. So I decided I was gonna preach on this topic, and it was really confirmed for me last weekend. We went to Kamloops to visit my family, and we went to the church that was there, and there was a lady that was kind of speaking about something I had never heard about. She was like giving a prophetic word for the church, and she said this word like estuary. I was like, what is that? What's an estuary? And so it really stuck out to me. She kind of talked a little bit about it, but I decided to look into it for myself. Basically what an estuary is it's like a fish nursery. So where rivers would, like fresh water would run into salt water, there's like these pools of water. And some of it's like higher salinity, like if it's closer to the ocean or if the tide is high, it'll be like more salty, but some of it is like fresh water. And so you can find like a lot of different species of fish living in these like estuaries. But it's actually a really important environment for a lot of marine fish because they lay their eggs there, and then it's a little safer than the ocean. So they'll go into these little estuaries, they'll have their babies. Their babies will get a chance to grow and develop a little bit more before they go out into the ocean. And so that's kind of what an estuary is. And I was like, how is that related to this topic of fear? So I started thinking about it a little bit, and I realized that there's a moment for all of those fish that are born in the estuary that kind of develop for the first little bit there, that they have to actually choose to go into the ocean. Right? It's like this moment of, okay, this is all I've ever known, is this safe little pond. And now it's time for me, because I'm getting bigger, I'm developing more, it's time for me to go out into the ocean, even though I don't know what's out there. So they go out into the ocean every single time. And I have some pictures. I don't know if they're going to put them up. But I don't know if you have ever seen those like documentaries where they show you comparisons with like the biggest animals they've found in the ocean and like humans or like the smallest fish. But some of them are going to show behind me. This is kind of what the fish in the estuary are going out towards. Like they don't know what's a predator, what is not going to eat them, but they go out into this gigantic ocean. It's much bigger than probably what they have ever seen before, because mostly because those predators aren't going to be in the estuaries. The estuary isn't big enough for them. So they go out into the ocean, even though this is what they're going to end up facing out there. Those are probably going to be playing for a while. But just looking at those pictures behind me, it like makes me never want to swim in the ocean again. I like think about that, and I'm just like, there's like the little guy next to those things. That's like a Japanese something spider, something. And it's like the grossest thing I've ever seen in my life. There it is. And so there's some really weird animals that live in the ocean, but I think about these like little marine fish that are just like developing, and they're kind of small still, but they choose to go out into the ocean anyways. I believe that God has designed everything in his creation to point to him. And so sometimes when I watch like a documentary about animals or about something like that, I'm just like, it's interesting how God designed this, because it really does point to what he talks about in Scripture. And I think that from looking at the situation of the little fish going out from the estuary into the ocean, it actually reminds me a lot of a story in the Bible that I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to be in Numbers 13. So if you want to go there in your Bibles. We're going to be in verse 17 to 20. Moses sent them to spy out the land. So at this point, I don't know if you probably have read this before, but the Israelites had been delivered out of slavery in Egypt. At this point, God's saying, I'm bringing you to a land that I've promised you. It's a great land. And they're on the edge of this land, and he says, I want some people to go into the land to kind of spy it out. So it says, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan. He said to them, go up into Negeb and go to the hill country and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is poor or rich, whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land back. Now the time was the season for the first ripe grapes. So sometimes you read through this, and I kind of say this a lot when I preach. We read through things, we don't really think about these people as real people, right? We're just kind of like, yeah, it happened thousands of years ago, like move on kind of thing. But you have to ask the question, why did God send spies into the land? And I was kind of thinking about this, and I was thinking, maybe it was because he wanted them to see the scary things. I think that sometimes God wants us to see what we're up against because he wants us to trust him that much more. He wants us to realize, okay, like here it is. There's actually something it is scary. Like you're going to see things that are going to scare you, but I'm a big God. You can trust me. I also think he wanted them to see the blessing that was there. I think he wanted them to know that this really was a land flowing with milk and honey, because he had told them that. He was like, this is your promised land is amazing. It's going to be abundant with crops. It's going to be fruitful. It's going to be amazing for you. And he wanted them to see that with their own eyes. So he not only wanted them to see, yeah, it might be scary there. There might be some things that you don't really like, but I'm a big God, and this is the blessing that I have for you. So the spies went into the land, and then they came back to report to Moses about what they had seen. It took them 40 days to find everything they did. They kind of wandered through the land. They gathered some evidence, like the fruit that they brought back. And then they came back to report to Moses about what they had seen. And that's found in Numbers 13, verse 26 to 31. It says, "And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of people in Israel and in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. They told him, 'We came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides this, we saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites and Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan.' But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it.' Then the men who had gone up with him said, 'We are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than we are.'" So the spies started out by saying, it is everything God promised us. Like, we can confirm that. We saw the fruit that was growing there. We saw how great the land is. And it does flow with milk and honey. Like, they were kind of confirming that this land was everything that God said it would be. But then we see that fear had infected them. They go on to say, "But the people there are very large and powerful. They're very strong. Their cities are huge, and they're stronger than we are." And they start to actually point at, this is our opposition. They point at like all of the things that they're going to have to deal with, the threats that they're going to have to come up against. And they start talking about that instead. But then there's this guy named Caleb, not the guy that's sitting over there. But there's this guy named Caleb, and he was there with them in the land. He was one of the spies that was there. And he was just like, wait a minute. It says he quieted the people. I don't know how he did that. I like to picture him being like, shut up. So he's like, he quieted the people, and he was like, we can do it, you guys. Like, we should go into the land. We should go in because God is with us. He's going to help us defeat our enemy. Like, he's trying to kind of turn the people away from their fear. But the people had seen with their own eyes, the spies had seen what they were up against. They had seen how large the men were and how big of a threat they were. And all it took was for them to allow a little seed of fear, right? All it took was for them to have that doubt that they were just like, wait a second, you know? Yeah, God brought us here, but can we really fight these people? You know, like almost like that kind of question. And then they answered that question in their own minds with no. They were like, nope, I don't think God can actually do this. Fear is a disease. I know this from my own life. It kind of takes hold of you and it starts to spread through you. And it's easy for us to look at all the things around us and be like, yeah. And we ask ourselves that question, can God really handle this? And sometimes we answer no. We're like, God, I don't think you can, or I don't think you want to. And then fear starts to grip us. We might think that we're not strong enough and that maybe it'd be easier to just give up. I heard a quote from a pastor. He said, both fear and faith are contagious, and you catch what you get close to. We're living in a time where it's pretty easy to get close to fear, right? Like, a lot of people have fear right now. Maybe it's always been that way. Maybe we're just noticing it more now. But it feels like it's pretty easy to hear about what people are scared of. Even if you have a normal conversation with someone, sometimes you can pick up the things that they're scared of just by them talking to you. And it's really easy to give in to fear. Our circumstances, even at the best of times, we start thinking about the future. We start thinking about things that we can't control. And it causes us to worry and fear what tomorrow might look like. Maybe you guys are kind of like I was or am. And somewhere along the line, fear kind of took root and it infected you. You're like, I don't really know when that moment was. I just know that over time, I just became more and more afraid. And it was things that I used to be able to handle, now I no longer seem to be able to. And this is where the Israelites were at. They had a choice to make. The spies that were afraid had a choice to either trust in God, to have faith, or to be afraid. And they chose to give in to their fear. They could have looked at the enemies in the land and they could have seen it as, this is an opportunity for God to show up, right? For him to show us again who he is, because he already had. He was, the entire time that they were wandering, he had been showing them his character. He had been showing them his power. They could have been like, you know what, God, you've showed yourself already. And this is just another chance for you to show us who you are. But maybe they also had a choice. They actually also had a choice if they were going to wonder if God really was capable of everything he said he would do. 10 of the spies chose their fear of their circumstances over faith. And it didn't stop there, unfortunately, because we also see later in the story that fear is contagious. Numbers 13, 32 to 33 is where we read about that. It says, so they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land and that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. All the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And fear began to spread. So the spies of the land tell everyone, they're like, these people are huge. There's no way that we're going to be able to defeat them. They're like gigantic. We're like bugs to them. And they spread this report through their lens of fear. Now they're not even talking to the people about, here's all the good things in the land, right? They're not saying, here's the fruit we brought back. It's worth it. Like, let's go into the land. They were like, nope, we're just spreading the bad reports. Only the things that we're scared of. They're saying things like, the land devours those that are living in it. And we're like little grasshoppers compared to them. I imagine it's kind of similar to maybe how it would be to be one of those fish leaving the estuary, right? Like, they don't know what's out there, but we do sometimes, right? We can see sometimes what we're going to come up against. And it started to spread through the Israelites until there was no one among them except for Joshua, Caleb, Moses, and Aaron who actually wanted to take the land that God had promised them. As a side note, I sometimes wonder if maybe they were exaggerating a little bit. I don't know, right? Like, it totally could have been as crazy as they said it was with the giants and like them being like grasshoppers. But sometimes I wonder if they were so afraid that their fears got bigger in their own mind. Like, they were just like, these men were normally like pretty large, but in their minds they were giants. Maybe subconsciously, they were exaggerating the details of what they saw because they didn't want people to want to go fight. Because when they reported to Moses, they said, the people are large, their cities are fortified. And then when they reported to the people, they were like, these people are giants. We're like little bugs. And that kind of reminds me of something my 4-year-old would say to like prove her point. She's like, I'm like a little bug. And I'm like, it's not real, but that's how she sees it. But fear does this in our minds. So maybe you guys have had this experience where your fear and your anxiety has made something out to be way bigger than it is. Not that you don't have something to be, concerned about, or you never have a reason to be concerned, but the thing that we are afraid of in our minds becomes so big that it almost seems impossible to face. I can say this from experience because I've had that in my own life. And then later I've looked back and I've been like, wow, was that really as big of a thing as I made it to be in my mind? Either way, the outcome was that fear spread through the people. The Israelites, even the ones that hadn't been in the land, they'd never seen these people. They've never seen the giants. They've never seen the cities. Now, all of a sudden, they didn't want to go anymore. They were like, I know God said this land is amazing. I know that he said that he would help us. But after hearing what these spies said about the land, I just don't think we can do it. I don't think it's worth it. And the thing that's crazy to me is that what the Israelites had seen was God's work in their own lives. So they hadn't seen the big giants in the land, the big scary cities, but they had seen God. They'd seen him work in their lives in amazing, miraculous ways. They had seen him deliver them from Egypt, from slavery that they thought they would be stuck in forever. They had seen him part the Red Sea so they could walk through on dry ground. And then he overtook Pharaoh so that Pharaoh couldn't get them. Then he led them by a pillar of fire and a cloud and showed them the direction to the promised land. This is like God showing them the way, literally directing them in a way they could see him. And then he provided them with food and water every single day. And they had been in this almost like bubble of provision, right? God had guided them and he had provided for them, and they really didn't have to do a whole lot to provide for themselves, to take care of themselves, because God was just doing that. And he was meeting with Moses, and Moses was bringing them messages from God. And now God was saying, it's time to go. Okay? I've protected you. I've provided for you. I've showed you who I am. I've showed you my power, what I'm capable of. Now it's time for you to have faith in me. I know it's scary out there, but I need you to trust who I've showed you that I am. I need you to step out in faith. And then he was trying to show them that there were good things on the other side of their fear. He was trying to show them the blessing that he had for them, the inheritance that he had for them. But fear had infected the Israelite people, and it had spread throughout the whole nation. We continue on in Numbers 14, 1-4, just the next chapter. Then the people of the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt." So the fear had spread so much that they couldn't even see how God had already blessed them and how he planned to bless them. They wanted to go back to slavery in Egypt instead of pushing forward to this new life that God had for them, to the things that they had already gotten a taste of, like the fruit of the land that they had brought back. Even though they saw Jesus or God come through time and time again, they were not willing to trust him. And after fear had infected and spread, it killed their faith. Joshua and Caleb, who had been in the land with the other 10 spies, tried to spread faith or rejuvenate their faith. In Numbers 14, 7-9, it says, "And he said to the congregation of people in Israel, 'The land which we passed through to spy it out is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them.'" But at this point, the infection had already spread through all the people, and all that they could feel was fear. They weren't able to listen to reason. They weren't able to listen to somebody who had faith in God because their fear was so loud. It was all they could hear. It was drowning out everything that they knew. Joshua tried to remind the people of who God was and to tell them about how great the land was. He's like, "I saw the land for myself. I was there. The land is great and amazing." And he tried to warn the people, don't rebel against God. Like, remember who he is, remember what he did. But they wouldn't listen, and we see in verse 10 how they responded. Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. So it spread through the people, and now the people couldn't hear faith anymore. And then they chose, instead of listening, to try to extinguish it. They were like, we need to kill these people. These people are dangerous because they're combating the fear that the people had. Fear will make you become hostile to faith, and it will kill any faith that you have. It might not happen overnight, but the more that you give in to fear, the more that it starts to destroy the faith that you have. Fear infects, fear spreads, and fear kills faith. The Israelites feared what they felt they couldn't face. They didn't feel that they had the strength. They didn't feel that God was with them. They didn't feel that they could do the things that God was asking them to do. They forgot the powerful God that had already led them so far. And God's response to this is in Numbers 14:11. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I've done among them?'" So they refused to believe. They refused to trust. There would be consequences for their fear. I don't know if you guys knew this, but there are consequences, natural consequences for our fear. So we might think it's easy to be in fear because it doesn't require action. But there are consequences that happen when you choose to give in to fear. And they didn't like what they heard. They would be forced to wander in the desert for 40 years. That's 1 year for every day the spies were in the land exploring in Canaan. Everyone who was 20 years old or older, who had been afraid, who had shown contempt for the Lord, would die in the wilderness before their children would ever inherit the land that God promised. Only Joshua and Caleb, who had faith, would see it. In Numbers 14:37, it says, "The men who brought up a bad report of the land died by plague before the Lord." So we see all those who spread the bad report, all those who came and said to the Israelites that were fearful, that said, we shouldn't do it. They spread this disease among the people. They died. And Moses told the people what the consequences of their lack of faith would be. The people see that what happens to the spies that spread the fear, and now they change their minds. So in Numbers 14:40, it says, "They rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, 'Here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned.'" As they're walking away from the land, they seem to realize, wow, these consequences suck. I don't really want to die in the desert. And they say, no. We made a mistake. Now we want to go into the promised land. Now we want to try to defeat the enemies. But Moses said in verse 41 and 42, "Why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord when that will not succeed? Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies." So Moses is saying the consequences have already happened. It's not that he doesn't love the people anymore, but he said, you guys made your choice. And there's something that you're going to have to deal with now because of that. And Moses is like, don't try to go do it on your own strength, because you're not going to succeed. All the things that you looked at in the land that you were like, that's going to destroy me if I go into the land, it will destroy you because God's not with you anymore. But this didn't stop them from trying. In Numbers 14:44-45, it says, "But they presumed to go to the heights of the hill country, although neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them, even to Hormah." So they tried to go into the land against what God wanted them to do. And they were literally beaten. In the NIV, it says they were beaten. They no longer had God's blessing to go in. They no longer had his power behind them. And it kind of shows what happens when we try to do things on our own strength as opposed to when God calls us into something. They had missed out on God's blessing because of their fear. So we skip ahead a little bit. It's 40 years later. The people who had showed contempt for the Lord had all passed away. And this new generation of the Israelite people has risen up, and they're ready to take on what God had asked them to do. They're at the border of the promised land again. And the interesting thing is there's a point where they're at this city called Jericho. And I'm sure you guys have heard this before. There's a kid's song about it. Maybe you heard it in Sunday school. I won't sing it. It's really good, though. You should check it out. So they get to Jericho they're like, we're going to defeat this city. We're going to take this city. But again, they send some spies into the city to see what they're up against. They're like, okay, we're going to check it out. So these two spies go into the city, and they end up hiding because people find out that they were there. And they end up hiding with a woman whose name is Rahab. And she would have been considered their enemy, obviously, because they're trying to take over her city. But it's interesting how she responds to them. In Joshua chapter 2, 8-11, it says, "Before the men lay down, Rahab came up to them on the roof and said to the men, 'I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us. And all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth beneath.'" So this is a woman from a pagan nation. She was not raised to know God in the way that the Israelite people were. She didn't grow up hearing about what happened like some of the Israelite children had in the desert. But 40 years later, she knows how God delivered the Israelite people out of Egypt and that he dried up the Red Sea so that they could walk through. So the people in Jericho had been talking about the amazing things that God had done for his people for 40 years. And they were scared of him. So imagine if they had come into the land when God told them to the first time. The city was already afraid, but they were afraid of them. And these are people who never saw these miracles for themselves. They only heard about it. They never saw with their own eyes what God could do, but they were still scared of him. They still knew his power. And Rahab, a woman from a pagan nation, knew who God was. In Joshua 2:11, she proclaims him as God in heaven above and on earth below. In other words, he's in control of everything. And what Rahab had in this moment was faith. She had faith in a God that she was never raised to know, but yet she knew him through the stories that she had heard. And her faith saved her and her entire family from destruction. She could have just been like, "There's no way you guys are going to defeat us." But she said, "Nope, you're definitely going to get this land because I know who your God is." It's true that fear can infect, fear can spread, and fear can kill your faith. But the same is true about faith. Because faith can be infectious. Faith can spread, and faith can kill fear. It does kill fear. And when we take a minute to look at the giant that we might be facing, or the thing that we're afraid of, and then we take that second and we look at who God is. We're like, who is this God that I serve? What has he already done in my life? Those giants start to seem smaller and smaller compared to what he can do. We serve a God who's bigger than our fear, and he's done it before. He's destroyed enemies before. And any time that we're afraid, we can expect him to do the same thing, because he's shown us who he is. Anytime the enemy tries to infect us with fear, we can remember God's promises. We can remember who he is and how he's already showed up. Having faith in God and being obedient doesn't mean things are going to be easy. You think back to my illustration earlier about the estuary. I'm sure it's still not easy for those little fish swimming out into the ocean, especially when you see everything that they're up against. But what if we stopped looking at it that way? What if we stopped seeing ourselves as so small and we started looking at the God that we serve? Because I guarantee you, he's a lot bigger than we are. And he's a lot bigger than the enemy is. When we step into the unknown, when God is asking us to, when we have faith in him, we can guarantee we're not going to be doing this alone. We're not going to be facing those giants, those fears by ourselves. And I think we get too comfortable doing things on our own strength. We think, it'd be pretty easy for me to just fake my way through it, even though I'm terrified, instead of being like, God, I really need you. Every time I come up here, I have to be like, God, I really need you, because I can't. Like, if it was just me up here, I'd be crying. I'd probably be sitting on the ground, and I'd be like, please don't judge me. But because God gives me confidence and boldness in who he is, I can stand up here even though I had fear, because I know who God is. And it's not just for me. You guys can have that same confidence too. Everywhere you go, you can say, yeah, you know what? This situation is really scary. But I know who God is, and I don't have to do this alone. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. Fear is really easy to get close to. It's easy to find, and it's easy to give into. But as Christians, we're not called to have contagious fear. We're called to have contagious faith. We're called to spread our faith to those around us, to lend them hope and faith for what could be. We're called to tell them about something that's bigger than themselves, and that's Christ. And when we tell them about who he is and that they can put their trust in him, that they can put their faith in him, then they can be without fear too. I think about when the Israelites were on the edge of the promised land, when they were standing there the first time and God was saying, I want you to go. Imagine if they had said yes in that moment. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever done that where you're like, wow, I wish I would have done that differently. I guarantee you for the 40 years they were wandering in the desert, that's what they were thinking. I really wish that I would have done that differently. I wish I would have said yes instead of saying no. How different would their lives have been if instead of giving in to that fear, they had said yes to God and yes to faith? It's not a one-time thing. I know that sometimes we like to think it's just going to be, here we go. I said yes to faith today, so I'm never going to be afraid again. It's a daily decision. If you're going to say no to your fear, every time there's an opportunity, not just when you feel like it, but every time God presents you with something and says, there's a fork in the road here. Like the Israelites standing on the edge of the promised land, there's a fork in the road. I can either choose fear or faith. Where am I going? I like to think of the analogy of a fire. Fires need oxygen to burn. So it's the same with your fear. If your fear isn't fed, it won't consume you. But if you continue to feed it, you continue to give into it, it's going to grow bigger and bigger until it just consumes all of who you are, including your faith. There are times when it'll be easier, or it will feel easier to give into fear. It'll be uncomfortable to face it. You might feel like, you know what? I don't have the strength today. But giving into fear isn't safe. It might feel safe in the moment, but the path that you're heading down isn't good for you. It isn't going to be a good outcome for you, and it's going to be really hard to climb out of that pit if you keep going down that road. It kills your faith, and it leaves you feeling like you have an impossible battle in front of you. We also miss the amazing things that God has for us and the blessing that's on the other side of fear. Sometimes our fear is so big we don't think to look around it and be like, what could it be that fear is trying to keep me from? What could it be, the blessing that God has for me, that He just wants me to step out in faith into the unknown? But if I don't do that, I'm not going to get to experience that. We think so much in the moment. We don't think about what facing our fear will do. So we have a choice to make. Instead of giving into the infection of fear, we can be like Rahab was. And our faith can be contagious to people around us, and it can actually bless others. It can remind us of the character of God and the power of God. It can remind us of who He is. Even when we don't feel like it, we can remember who He is. And we can remember the good that's on the other side of fear. We can focus on the future. Focus on what God has for us and those around us. Maybe when you came into church, maybe you're new here, maybe you've been here for a while, but when you came in, you were in a really vulnerable place. Like, you were like, I can't step out of my faith. I need that estuary. I need to just be okay and grow and be safe. And that's good, that's important. But maybe you've been in there a long time. And maybe you're starting to get really big in your faith, and you're just like, man, I don't feel challenged anymore. I feel like I've just been comfortable and just coasting. So maybe it's time for you to take that next step in your faith. Maybe it's time for you to start looking for situations around you where God might be asking you to do something uncomfortable. He might be asking you to do something hard. Maybe it's time to grow in spiritual maturity. Maybe you've been thinking about taking that step in faith, but fear has been holding you back. Let me tell you something. Fear, it's never going to go away. So if you think you're just going to wait until fear goes away before you take that step of faith, it's not going to happen. It's probably just going to get harder. Every time you step out in faith, that thing that you're stepping into gets easier to do. And then God asks you to do something hard again. And then you step out into that thing, and it's still hard, and you're still afraid. But the more you say no to your fear, the smaller that flame gets. And then we realize we have a choice. When we start saying no to fear, we realize we have a choice. We don't have to be powerless. We don't have to be like, well, this is just who I am. Look at all the stuff that happened to me. Of course I'm afraid. You can say, no, I'm actually choosing to say no to my fear. I'm choosing to say yes to following God and to having faith. And don't wait to say yes. Start saying no to fear now. And slowly God will put those fears to death. Like Rahab said, the Lord our God is the God in heaven above and on the earth below. And because of this, the Lord has given us this land. He has given us power over fear. There's a verse that we always say with our kids when they're scared, and I want you guys to say it with me today. I think it's going to be up on the back. 2 Timothy 1:7. So you guys just say it with me. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. This means that if you're fighting a battle of fear, maybe it feels like multiple battles, the these are not from the Lord, he will use them, but fear doesn't come from him. I believe God wants to come into those situations that you might be facing, and I believe he wants to start breaking off those chains, and he wants to start putting out that fire that has tried to consume you, that has tried to destroy your faith. And I believe God wants to renew your faith today. So I'm going to pray, and we're going to have some people over in the prayer corner. If you need prayer, it doesn't have to be about fear, but if you need prayer, you feel like fear has just been controlling your life for too long, I just want you to take that step of faith, right? Like I said, it's an action. You have to do something. So even if you're sitting there in the pew and you're like, yeah, I actually really do need prayer, but I don't want to. That's your fear. So we're going to be standing there and we're going to pray for you. And I believe that God's going to do amazing things in people here today, and that people's faith will be renewed today. So God, I just pray for everybody here. Lord, I pray against the spirit of fear that has tried to infect so many of your people, God, that has spread rampant through congregations of churches and believers, God, that we have forgotten maybe who you are and what you've done in our lives. I pray that you would remind us right now, that you would show us a picture of who you are, that you would show us how much you love us, and that we are safe with you even if it seems uncertain stepping out in faith. God, I ask that you would just begin to work in our hearts and in minds today, that you would give people boldness and courage to step out in faith and to continue to fight against fear, not just once, but every day, that they would say no to fear and yes to faith in you.